Right. What is happening, people? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are opening the file that the world simply cannot close. We are talking about the vanishing of Madeleine McCann. You might think you know the story, but trust me, you have no idea what is coming. We have got a window that might never have been opened. Twins who mysteriously would not wake up, and a German drifter living just down the road. We are looking at deleted phone logs, a washed toy that destroyed evidence, and specialist dogs alerting to forensic traces inside the apartment. Was it a kidnapping, or was it the ultimate cover-up? Before we unravel the lies, do me a massive favor. Smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. You do not want to miss this. Let us get into it. The group sat around the table, their laughter cutting through the warm evening air, a sound that felt entirely natural in a place built for leisure. There were 9 of them in total, a collection of doctors and professionals who had retreated to this corner of the Algarve to escape the pressures of their demanding lives back in the United Kingdom. They called themselves the Tapas 7, a nickname born from their nightly ritual of dining at the open-air restaurant just a short walk from their apartments. It was a routine that had been established early in the holiday. Tennis lessons in the morning, the children safely deposited in the kids' clubs during the day, and then the evenings, which belonged to the adults. Kate and Gerry sat amongst their friends, the exhaustion of parenthood momentarily lifted by the company and the wine. They were relaxed. Why would they not be? The resort felt like a sanctuary, a contained world where the dangers of the outside seemed miles away. It was a golden cage, safe and predictable. The system they had devised for the evenings was simple, and they believed, foolproof. They would leave the children asleep in the apartments, which were only a short distance away, and take turns walking back to check on them every 20 or 30 minutes. It was a compromise, allowing them the freedom of an adult dinner while maintaining a tether to their sleeping offspring. On this particular night, May 3rd, 2007, the mood was light, but beneath the surface, the fatigue of the week was setting in. The children had been exhausted from the day's activities. In apartment 5A, the 3 young children had been put to bed. The routine had been executed with military precision. Stories were read, lights were dimmed, and the door was pulled to, leaving just a sliver of light from the hallway. Gerry was the first to leave the table to conduct his check. It was just after 9 o'clock. He walked the short distance to the ground-floor apartment, entering through the unlocked patio doors. The decision to leave them unlocked had been made for ease of access, a decision that would later be scrutinized by the entire world. He stepped inside, listening for the rhythm of breathing. He saw Madeleine lying soundly in her bed, the twins asleep in travel cots nearby. Everything was silent. Everything was as it should be. He paused for a moment, perhaps to use the bathroom, perhaps just to relish the silence, before returning to the restaurant. He told the group that all was well. The system continued. The wine flowed, and the conversation drifted from tennis scores to work gossip. The next check was meant to be done by Kate, but another member of the group, Matthew Oldfield, offered to go instead as he was checking his own children in the adjacent apartment. He walked to 5A. He did not go all the way into the room. He stood at the threshold, listening. He heard nothing. He saw the twins, but from his angle, he could not clearly see the bed where Madeleine slept. He assumed, in the quiet of the night, that silence equated to safety. He turned back, returning to the dinner table with a report that everything was fine. It was 10 o'clock when Kate stood up. It was her turn. She walked the familiar path, the air cooling as the night deepened. She reached the patio doors and slid them open. It was quiet, just as it had been for Gerry and Matthew. But as she stepped into the living area, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The door to the children's bedroom, which they had left slightly ajar, was now standing wide open. A draught caught her attention. She moved toward the bedroom, her heart beating a slow, confused rhythm. As she entered the room, Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She looked at the twin travel cots. 2 sleeping forms were visible. Then she looked at the bed against the wall. The covers were pulled back. The pillow was empty. For a second, the mind refused to process the visual data. She assumed Madeleine had woken up and wandered into their bed in the other room. Kate turned and checked the parents' bedroom. Empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her skin. She ran back to the children's room. The window, which had been shut when they left, was open. The external shutter was raised completely. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The silence of the room was not peaceful. It was hollow. She ran to the patio doors, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She sprinted back toward the restaurant, her composure shattering with every step. The table of friends looked up as she approached. They saw her face before they heard her voice. It was a mask of absolute terror. She did not scream immediately. The words were stuck in her throat, choking her. When they finally tore loose, they were not a question, but a statement that would haunt every person at that table for the rest of their lives. "She's gone," Kate screamed, her voice cracking. "They've taken her." The golden cage had been broken. The sanctuary was gone. In its place was a void, dark and terrifying, that had swallowed the little girl whole. The transition from a holiday dinner to a crime scene was instantaneous and chaotic. The Tapas 7 abandoned their meal, chairs scraping loudly against the terrace floor as they rushed toward the apartments. The staff at the Ocean Club, initially confused by the commotion, soon realized the gravity of the situation as the word spread like a virus through the complex. A child was missing. In the immediate aftermath, logic gave way to frantic action. The group split up, running in different directions, shouting Madeleine's name into the darkness. They checked the swimming pools, fearing a tragic accident. They checked the roads, the tennis courts, the bushes. Every shadow looked like a hiding place. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. The local police, the GNR, were called, but their arrival was slow. The urgency of the situation lost in translation, and the relaxed pace of the region. When they did arrive, the scene was already compromised. Dozens of people, friends, resort staff, and other holidaymakers had trampled through apartment 5A. They had touched surfaces, opened doors, and walked through the very room where the abduction had allegedly taken place. The preservation of evidence, crucial in the first golden hours of an investigation, was non-existent. Inside the apartment, the focus narrowed to the point of entry and exit. Kate was adamant. The window in the children's bedroom had been open. The shutter, a heavy metal contraption that required force to lift, was raised. She insisted that she had not opened it, nor had Gerry. The implication was clear. Someone had come in, or someone had gone out through that window. However, as the initial shock began to subside, questions arose. The police examined the shutters. There was no sign of forced entry. No gemmy marks. No broken metal. The shutters could only be opened from the inside using a strap, or from the outside if they were not fully locked down. If an abductor had entered through the patio doors, which were left unlocked, why exit through a small window, carrying a child, and risking the noise of the metal shutters? It was a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Then came the first major timeline marker, a revelation that would steer the investigation for weeks. Jane Tanner, one of the 7 friends dining with the McCanns, came forward with a memory that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now held terrifying weight. She told the police that earlier in the evening, around 9:15, she had walked past the apartment to check on her own daughter. In the darkness, she had seen a man walking away from the direction of the McCann's apartment. He was crossing the road, heading away from the resort. Jane described the man as carrying a child. The child was dressed in pajamas. The man was walking with purpose but not running. At the time, She had assumed it was simply another parent carrying a sleeping child home from the night creche or a dinner. It was a common sight in a family resort, but now, with Madeleine gone, the image transformed in her memory. The timing was critical. 9:15. This was squarely between Gerry's check at 9 o'clock and the check Matthew Oldfield made later. If Jane was right, the abduction had happened in a razor-thin window of time. It meant the abductor had been watching, waiting for Gerry to leave, and had struck with terrifying precision before Jane walked by. But this timeline created a friction, a grinding inconsistency that the detectives could not ignore. If the abductor took the child at 9:15, why did Matthew Oldfield not notice the empty bed when he listened at the door later? Was the child already gone, and he simply missed it in the dark? Or was the child still there, meaning Jane Tanner's sighting was irrelevant, a red herring that would send the police chasing a phantom for months? The narrative was splitting. On one side, a frantic parent's story of a predator who pried open a window and vanished into the night. On the other, a growing list of logistical impossibilities. The patio door was unlocked, yet the window was the focus. The child was taken at 9:15, yet another person listened for breathing afterward. As the sun began to rise over Praia da Luz on the morning of May 4th, the resort was no longer a paradise. It was a grid of search sectors. The police taped off the apartment, far too late to save the forensic integrity of the scene. The timeline was not a straight line. It was a tangled knot of minutes and seconds, of missed glances and assumptions. And at the center of it all was the terrifying silence of a room that should have been filled with the sound of a sleeping child. The investigation had begun, but the truth was already slipping further into the shadows. The desperation for a culprit in the days following the disappearance was a palpable force, a hunger that needed to be fed. The police, under immense pressure from the international media and the diplomatic weight of the British government, needed a suspect. They needed a name and a face to attach to the crime, someone who fit the profile of a predator lurking in the shadows. 12 days after the child vanished, the spotlight swung violently toward a local resident, a man who had initially tried to help. Robert Murat was a 34-year-old property consultant, a man of dual heritage who straddled the line between the local Portuguese community and the British expatriates. He lived in a villa known as Casa Liliana, a sprawling property situated only 137 meters from apartment 5A. It was this proximity that first drew the gaze of the detectives. In a crime where the timeline was measured in minutes, distance was everything. A man who could vanish from the resort and be behind the walls of his own home in seconds was a man worth investigating. However, it was not just his address that damned him. It was his behavior. In the chaotic hours and days after the alarm was raised, Murat had stepped forward. Fluent in both languages, he offered his services as an unpaid translator for the police and the journalists swarming the village. He was everywhere, asking questions, translating statements, and lingering near the center of the investigation. To him, this was a civic duty, a way to assist in a tragedy. To the hardened detectives of the Judiciary Police, this was classic insertion. They theorized that he was injecting himself into the inquiry to monitor their progress, to steer them away from the truth, or to relive the thrill of the crime. The suspicion turned into a witch hunt with terrifying speed. The media, starving for a villain, latched onto his physical appearance. Murat had a glass eye, the result of a motorcycle accident in his youth. In the tabloids and the whispers of the town, this medical feature was twisted into a sign of villainy. They wrote that he had a cast to his eye, a sinister look that unnerved people. Witnesses began to come forward with vague, unsettling claims. One person stated that he gave off a vibe similar to notorious criminals from the past, a statement that held no legal weight but devastated his reputation in the court of public opinion. The fact that he lived with his mother was weaponized against him. It was painted as a sign of social maladjustment, a red flag that hinted at a man who had failed to launch, a man with secrets. The police acted on these suspicions with overwhelming force. They descended on Casa Liliana, turning the sanctuary of his home into a forensic battleground. They drained the swimming pool, searching for a body or a weapon. They dug up the garden, overturning the earth in a desperate hunt for evidence. Inside, they seized computers, phones, and personal videotapes, looking for the digital footprint of a monster. Murat was brought in for questioning that lasted for hours. They grilled him on his movements, his relationships, and his intentions. He was named an arguido, a formal suspect, a label that carried a heavy stigma in the Portuguese legal system. His life was dissected under a microscope. His business associates were dragged into the fray. One had his car set on fire outside his home, a vigilante act born from the hysteria that Murat was the key to the mystery. Yet, as the dust settled and the forensic reports came back, the case against him began to crumble. There was no DNA. There were no fingerprints connecting him to the apartment. The suspicious phone calls he had made on the night of the disappearance were traced to family members and friends. Innocent conversations misconstrued by investigators desperate for a lead. The witnesses who claimed to see him near the apartment gave contradictory times and descriptions. Robert Murat was innocent. He was a victim of geography and generosity, a man who tried to bridge the gap between two cultures and fell into the chasm between them. But the damage was done. The investigation had lost precious weeks chasing a phantom, fixating on a man because he looked the part, while the real trail grew colder by the day. As the summer heat intensified, the atmosphere within the investigation underwent a chilling transformation. The sympathy that had initially surrounded Kate and Gerry McCann began to curdle into suspicion. The Portuguese police, frustrated by the lack of physical evidence linking an intruder to the scene, began to turn their eyes toward the people who were last to see the child alive, her parents. This shift was not sudden, but a gradual accumulation of doubts, fed by cultural differences and behaviors that the local detectives found baffled. In the eyes of the Portuguese authorities, the grieving process had a specific look, a specific weight. They expected wailing, paralysis, and a total collapse of daily function. What they saw, instead, was a disciplined, organized campaign that seemed to bypass the raw emotion of the tragedy. The detectives fixated on the parents' physical activities. They noted that Gerry McCann had been seen playing tennis in the days following the disappearance. To the father, this might have been a way to manage stress, a coping mechanism to keep his body moving when his mind was trapped in hell. To the police, it looked like indifference. How could a father play a sport when his daughter was missing? Similarly, the couple went jogging along the cliffs and beaches. The investigators questioned how they had the physical stamina to run when they should have been prostrate with grief. Then there was the media strategy. Within days, the couple had hired public relations consultants. They were giving polished interviews, managing the news cycle, and keeping the story on the front pages of the world. While effective in keeping the search alive, this level of professional detachment raised eyebrows in the interrogation rooms. The police began to wonder if this was a search for a missing child or a management of a narrative. The suspicion deepened when the focus returned to the apartment. The police had found no evidence of a break-in, no forced locks, no shattered glass. This led them to a dark hypothesis. What if there was no abductor? What if the child had died inside the apartment and the window was staged? Two specific incidents fueled this fire. The first involved a soft toy, a pink stuffed cat known as Cuddle Cat, which the child had cherished. It was the one item Kate carried with her everywhere, a symbol of her missing daughter. However, the police discovered that Kate had washed the toy. She explained it was dirty from being carried around, but the forensic team was aghast. By washing the toy, she had potentially destroyed the most vital scent reference for the tracker dogs and removed any biological trace of the abductor that might have been transferred during the crime. Was it a mother's hygiene instinct, or was it a forensic cleanup? The second incident involved technology. The police requested the mobile phone records of the group to build a timeline of communication. When they analyzed the phones of Kate and Gerry, they discovered that call logs from the period immediately surrounding the disappearance had been deleted. The parents could not provide a technical explanation that satisfied the detectives. Why would calls be erased from the most critical hours of their lives? The tide had fully turned. The parents were no longer just the victims. They were becoming the focus. The investigation began to operate on a dual track, publicly searching for a missing girl, while privately building a case against the very people who were begging for her return. The theory of an abduction was being slowly dismantled, replaced by a darker, more complex theory of an accident, a cover-up, and a conspiracy of silence among friends. The golden cage of the resort had become a pressure cooker, and the walls were closing in on the apartment where it all began. The investigation had stalled. The physical searches of the scrubland had yielded nothing but dust and discarded trash. The interviews had gone in circles. The Portuguese authorities, feeling the pressure of the world's gaze, decided to bring in a different kind of expert. They were not human detectives with biases or theories. They were biological instruments, trained to detect what the human eye could not see and the human nose could not smell. They were two English Springer Spaniels, named Eddie and Keela. Their arrival at the resort marked a significant escalation in the forensic approach. Eddie was trained as an enhanced victim recovery dog. His specific purpose was to detect specific biological evidence, a scent that is distinct and impossible to mask from a canine nose. Keela was a crime scene dog, trained to detect human blood, even in microscopic quantities or after attempts had been made to clean it up. They worked as a team. Eddie would find the general area of death, and Keela would pinpoint the blood. The handlers took the dogs to apartment 5A. The space had been cleaned since the disappearance, scrubbed for the next guests. But the handlers knew that scent molecules could linger in the pores of the plaster, the fibers of the carpet, and the cracks of the tiles for months. The apartment was emptied of people. The handler sent Eddie in first. The dog moved through the living area, his nose working overtime. He bypassed the kitchen. He bypassed the parents' bedroom. But when he reached the area behind the sofa, near the large window that looked out onto the street, his demeanor changed. He stopped. He became agitated. He barked. This was the alert. To the handler, it was a clear signal. The dog had detected the scent of a dead body in that specific corner of the room. Eddie was then moved to the bedroom where the children had slept. He moved toward the wardrobe, a built-in closet near the bed. Again, the reaction was immediate. He alerted at the wardrobe door. The implication was terrifying. The dog was suggesting that a serious incident had occurred in the living room and in the bedroom. Next, Keela was brought in. She was trained to ignore the scent of death and focus solely on blood. She moved to the same spot behind the sofa where Eddie had barked. She alerted. The forensic team moved the furniture and pulled up the tiles. Underneath, in the raw concrete, the dog indicated the presence of biological fluids. The search moved outside. The dogs were taken to the small private garden and the flower beds that lined the apartment. Eddie ran along the perimeter. He stopped at a specific patch of earth in the flower bed. He barked again. For the Portuguese detectives, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. In their minds, the narrative shifted instantly. The dogs had provided a scientific basis for the theory that the child had not been abducted, but had died inside the apartment. They theorized that the body had been hidden behind the sofa, then perhaps moved to the wardrobe, and temporarily concealed in the flower bed before being moved to a final location. However, the interpretation of this evidence became a battlefield. The defense for the parents, and indeed the British police protocols, urged caution. They argued that the scent of death is not DNA, it is not a fingerprint. They pointed out that scent can transfer. It can cling to clothes, to objects, to shoes. They argued that the apartment had been rented by many families before the McCanns. Could a previous occupant have cut themselves? Could a child have had a nosebleed behind the sofa years ago? The dogs were infallible in their detection of scent, but they could not date that scent. They could not say this blood is from May 3rd. They could only say there is blood here. But for the parents, the damage was done. The image of the cadaver dog barking in their holiday apartment was leaked to the press, and the tide of public opinion, which had been slowly turning, now crashed against them with the force of a tidal wave. The scent of death hung over the investigation, invisible but suffocating. While the forensic team was tearing apart the apartment in search of microscopic evidence, another narrative thread began to unravel, one that had been ignored for months. It centered on a family from Ireland, the Smith family, who had been holidaying in Praia da Luz at the same time as the McCanns. Martin Smith provided a statement that would eventually become one of the most significant and controversial pieces of the puzzle. On the night of the disappearance, the Smith family had been out for dinner. They were walking back to their accommodation around 10 o'clock in the evening. This time was crucial. It was 45 minutes after the Jane Tanner sighting, the sighting that had pinned the abduction to 9:15. As the Smiths walked up a street that led away from the Ocean Club and toward the beach, they passed a man. The street was poorly lit, illuminated only by the orange glow of street lamps. Martin Smith recalled the encounter vividly because the man seemed out of place, yet entirely ordinary. He described a man who was white, aged between 35 and 40. He was wearing beige trousers and a dark blazer. But it was what he was carrying that drew Smith's attention. The man was holding a young child in his arms. The child was a girl, around 3 or 4 years old. She had blonde hair and was wearing light-colored pajamas. She was not awake. She was in a deep sleep, her head resting against the man's shoulder, her arms hanging down by her side. The man did not look like a fugitive. He did not look panicked. He walked with a steady, rhythmic pace. He did not attempt to hide his face, but he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the Smith family as they passed. He looked, to all intents and purposes, like a father carrying his sleeping daughter home after a late night. At the time, Martin Smith thought nothing of it. It was a resort full of families, but the next morning, when the news broke that a blonde girl had vanished, the image of the man in the beige trousers returned to him with sickening clarity. He contacted the police. For a long time, the Smith sighting was sidelined. The investigators were fixated on the Jane Tanner timeline of 9:15. They believed the abductor had struck then. The man Smith saw at 10 o'clock did not fit their established sequence of events. If the Tanner sighting was the abduction, who was the man Smith saw? Was he an accomplice? Or was he just a tourist? But as the investigation dragged on and the Tanner sighting began to lose credibility, eventually being identified as an innocent British holidaymaker carrying his own child, the police circled back to Martin Smith. They looked closer at his description. They compared it to the men in the group. Years later, a reconstruction was done. They analyzed the way the man was carrying the child. He did not hold her in the cradle position, wrapped in a blanket. He held her vertically, her chest against his chest, his hands supporting her bottom. It was a specific, somewhat awkward way to carry a sleeping child. Video footage from the holiday emerged of Gerry McCann carrying his children. He carried them in exactly the same manner. The beige trousers matched trousers Gerry owned. The dark blazer matched his clothing. Martin Smith, when pressed years later, stated that the man he saw bore a striking resemblance to the father of the missing girl. He stated he was 60 to 80% sure it was him. This revelation sent a shockwave through the case. If the man Smith saw was Gerry McCann, it placed him outside the apartment, carrying his daughter toward the beach. At 10 o'clock at night, an hour after he claimed to have last seen her safe in bed, and simultaneous to the moment Kate raised the alarm, The phantom in the night was no longer a faceless stranger in a hoodie. The sighting transformed into a mirror, reflecting the investigation back onto the family. Was it possible that the father was wandering the streets with the child while the mother was screaming for help? Or was it a doppelganger, a cruel coincidence of a man who looked like him, dressed like him, and carried a child like him? Walking through the very heart of the mystery, the Smith sighting did not solve the puzzle. It shattered it into 1,000 sharper, more dangerous pieces. 5 weeks had passed since the night the alarm was raised. The initial frenzy of the search had settled into a grim, exhausting routine. The media trucks were still parked on the edges of the village, but the police presence had shifted from a visible army to a shadow operation. It was in this atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that the McCanns decided to hire a vehicle. It was a silver Renault Scenic, a practical car for a family, intended to help them move around the region as they continued their campaign to find their daughter. But to the detectives watching from unmarked cars, the rental of the vehicle marked a sinister turning point in the investigation. The police found the timing peculiar. Why now? Over a month later, they began to track the movements of the Renault with intensity. Every trip to the supermarket, every drive to the beach, and every visit to the rubbish dumps was logged. The car became a mobile fishbowl, and the detectives were waiting for a slip. It was not long before witnesses began to report strange behavior involving the vehicle. A woman who lived near the villa the family was renting, a lawyer, by profession, contacted the authorities with an observation that defied logic. She stated that she had seen the Renault parked outside the property with its boot lid wide open. It was not just for a few minutes while groceries were unloaded. She claimed the boot was left gaping open for hours, sometimes extending into the night. To the casual observer, it might have looked like someone airing out a vehicle that had grown hot in the sun. To the investigators, who were already building a theory of accidental death and concealment, it looked like something far more specific. They theorized that the boot was being aired out to disperse a smell, the distinct, heavy scent that alarmed the investigators. It was not just the police who noticed it. The family's own circle began to comment on the odor emanating from the vehicle. Michael Wright, a relative, admitted to the police that there was a foul stench in the car. He offered a domestic explanation. The family had been transporting rubbish, including soiled nappies from the twins, and perhaps some had leaked into the upholstery. It was a plausible, mundane reason. The kind of mess that happens in the chaotic life of a family with toddlers. However, another relative, Alexander Cameron, provided a detail that was far more visceral. He told the investigators that the smell was so overpowering he could barely stand it. He attributed it to a shopping trip where a bag of frozen meat, shrimp, and beef had leaked into the boot carpet. He claimed the fluids had seeped into the fabric, rotting in the heat, creating a stench of death that was purely culinary in origin. He even described scrubbing the boot himself, removing the carpet to wash away the fluids from the leakage. The police did not believe in leaked shrimp or dirty nappies. They believed the smell was the biological residue of the missing child. They theorized that the body had been moved from a temporary hiding place, perhaps the flower bed or the wardrobe, and transported in the boot of the Renault to a final, unknown location, weeks after the death. The open boot was not an accident. It was a desperate attempt to purge the car of the evidence before it could be seized. The Renault was eventually impounded. The forensic teams descended on it, stripping the interior. They took fiber samples, vacuumed the carpets, and swabbed the surfaces. They were looking for the invisible ghost of the child. The dogs, Eddie and Keela, were brought to the car. Both alerted. Eddie barked at the boot, signaling the scent of a cadaver. Keela alerted to the key fob, suggesting the presence of biological material on the keys themselves. The car, a banal piece of rental machinery, had become a tomb of evidence. Yet, the defense argued furiously. They pointed out that the family had transported the twins in that car. Their DNA would naturally be there. They argued that corpse scent could be transferred on clothing from the apartment to the car seats. The smell of spoiling food was chemically similar to the specific scent the dogs were trained to find. The Renault Scenic sat in the police impound, a silent metal box that held either the answer to the crime or a series of terrible, innocent coincidences. The samples taken from the boot of the Renault Scenic were a mess. In the world of forensic science, they were classified as low copy number DNA. This meant the biological material was degraded, mixed, and present in such minute quantities that standard testing methods struggled to make sense of it. The lab in Birmingham, one of the most respected in the world, ran the tests. The results came back with a frustrating label: inconclusive. The report stated that the DNA profile found in the car boot was a complex mixture. There were markers that matched the missing child, but there were also markers that could have belonged to her parents or her siblings. The statistical probability was not high enough to stand up in a court of law. It was a maybe. And in a murder investigation, a maybe is as good as a no. Enter Dr. Mark Perlin. He was an American scientist, a pioneer in the field of cybergenetics. He had developed a computer program called TrueAllele, a system designed specifically to untangle these complex DNA knots. His software could take the raw data from a low copy number sample and mathematically separate the mixtures, calculating a likelihood ratio that was far more precise than human analysis. He had used this technology to identify victims of the World Trade Center attacks and to exonerate innocent men on death row. Dr. Perlin looked at the case from across the Atlantic. He saw the impasse. He saw a family living under a cloud of suspicion and a police force desperate for certainty. He believed his technology could provide the answer. If the DNA in the boot belonged to the missing child, TrueAllele would confirm it with a high degree of certainty. If it did not, it would rule it out, clearing the parents of the suspicion that they had transported a body. He made an extraordinary offer. He contacted the Metropolitan Police, who were by then assisting the review of the case. He contacted the McCann's private investigation team. He offered to analyze the data from the Renault Scenic samples for free. He did not need the physical samples. He only needed the electronic data files generated by the lab in Birmingham. It was a process that would take days, not months. The response he received was a wall of silence. The British police did not take him up on the offer, citing procedural reasons and their reliance on their own forensic providers. The parents' team did not pursue it either. This refusal became one of the most baffling aspects of the entire saga. Why would an investigation, which had spent millions of pounds chasing leads across the globe, refuse a free scientific test that could definitively answer the question of the car? If the parents were innocent, Dr. Perlin's test was their golden ticket to exoneration. It would prove that the biological material in the boot was not their daughter's, supporting the theory of the leaked meat or the transfer of innocent DNA. If they were guilty, the test was a loaded gun. Dr. Perlin persisted. He wrote letters. He gave interviews. He explained that inconclusive was not a scientific reality, but a failure of interpretation. He argued that the data was there, sitting in a file, waiting to be read. He stated that he had never seen a case where evidence that could resolve a central mystery was so willfully ignored. The samples remained in storage. The electronic files remained unopened by TrueAllele. The inconclusive result was allowed to stand, a gray fog that suited everyone and no one. For the believers in the parents' innocence, it was proof of nothing. For the skeptics, it was proof of a cover-up. The DNA doctor remained on the outside, a man with the key to a locked door that no one wanted to open. The science existed to illuminate the darkness of the Renault boot. But the decision was made, consciously or not, to leave the lights switched off. The chaos that erupted in apartment 5A on the night of the 3rd of May was loud enough to wake the dead. It was a cacophony of terror. The primal screams of a mother discovering an empty bed, the shouting of friends coordinating a search, the heavy boots of the police officers thumping against the tiled floors, and the slamming of doors as people ran in and out. The noise spilled out into the street and echoed through the complex. Yet, amidst this storm of sound, there was an island of unnatural silence. In the center of the room, amidst the panic, the two younger siblings, Sean and Amelie, remained fast asleep. They did not stir when their mother screamed. They did not wake when the police shone flashlights into their cots. They did not cry when the strangers lifted them from their beds to transport them to another apartment for safety. They remained in a deep, heavy slumber that bordered on the comatose. To the Portuguese detectives, this heavy sleep was a red flag.